It was one of those sweltering days of the summer of 1935. The weather was unusually calm, but the sky was covered with a gray weariness. In my years as a pilot in the Royal Air Force, such weather always made me uneasy. You could neither escape the storm nor feel the freshness that the sky promised. Everything was still, but at the same time uncomfortably waiting. That morning, I was assigned to inspect an abandoned airfield near Edinburgh. The airfield was in a dilapidated state, having ceased to be used many years ago. I didn't know what to look for or what I would find there. Perhaps it was just a formality. Still, such missions were part of the discipline. No one questioned what was done and when. When I boarded my plane and took off, I felt a strange uneasiness. The sky was filled with a dim and faint light despite the morning hours. I could feel that something was wrong along my flight route, but I couldn't make sense of it. When I arrived at the airport, everything was worse than I had imagined. As I walked along the abandoned runway, I could hear the sound of crunching stones and grass under my feet. There were cracks in the concrete, as if no human hand had touched this place for a long time, nor an airplane tire. The hangars swayed in the wind, the old metal doors banged back and forth. These huge buildings where airplanes were supposed to be stored were now empty, dark and eerie. When I walked in, there was old abandoned equipment on the floor, rusted tools and tracks that had once served a purpose but were now stuck in the past. As I was making notes in my notebook, I realized that this area had been completely forgotten. Maybe no one had visited it for years. The weeds around the runway were so overgrown that I couldn't see the edge of the runway. It was like an abandoned world, as if there had once been life here and then suddenly everything had disappeared. After completing my mission, I returned to my plane, but just as I was getting ready to take off, I noticed that the sky was darkening rapidly. Heavy clouds were gathering on the horizon and the wind was picking up fast. Suddenly the raindrops started hitting the windshield of the plane, slowly at first, then so fast that my visibility was almost zero. The storm was inevitable, so I stayed in the air for a while and tried to find a suitable gap, but the strong winds and heavy rainfall made even the controls on my plane difficult. Flying into the clouds in the middle of a storm, for a moment everything went black. The sound of the engine turned into a hum, and in that moment, I faced one of the worst feelings a pilot can experience. I lost my bearings. After a few minutes that felt like hours, I decided that my only option was to go back to the abandoned airport where I had started. But that's when it all started, Mr. Bellington. As I turned around in the middle of the storm and headed for the airport, the sky had turned such a dark gray that it was as if I was flying into a wall. The rain was pounding madly against the fuselage of the plane, the view outside was completely obliterated, and everything was covered in a white fog. My radio links were cut, my compass was spinning meaninglessly, and I could only act on intuition. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, trying to keep the plane as steady as I could. At one point, in the middle of the storm, I felt that the engine was running strangely intermittently, like it would stop for a moment, and then it would start again. This is scary for pilots because it's only a matter of time before you lose control. But what was really strange was not the sound of the engine, but the change in the environment. Suddenly the fog thinned, then the clouds began to clear rapidly. The rain stopped. It was as if the sky had suddenly given up on the storm. But this transition did not feel like a natural process. It was as if something had forced this change. When I squinted and looked ahead, I saw the runway of the abandoned airport, but it was no longer a familiar sight. The track was not the barren place I had seen a few hours earlier. The edge lines were painted a fresh white. The runway was surrounded not by weeds but by neatly cut grass. It was as if this was still an active airport, not an abandoned place. When my eyes shifted to the hangars, my astonishment grew exponentially. The old and rusty buildings I had toured before now looked brand new. The metal structures shone in the sun, as if they had just been built. One of the hangar doors was open and I could see a few technicians working inside. Where before there was no one, now there was movement. The mechanics were working hard, dressed in blue overalls. I could see so clearly that one of them had put down his toolbox and was examining the plane's landing gear with a large wrench in his hand. Another was carrying a heavy box, and I noticed a concentrated look on his face, which forced me to freeze completely. Because this was the place that had just been abandoned, and there was no way this could have happened. But the most amazing thing was the airplanes on the runway. 4 planes stood on the runway, all painted bright yellow. 2 of them looked like the Hawker Hart bombers that are common in the Royal Air Force. But the other 2 were different. One in particular was completely different from the others in its design. It was small, streamlined, and futuristic. The wings had a slight slope at the tips, and the cockpit was more rounded and modern. Having seen dozens of different airplane models in my lifetime, I was not familiar with this design. There were no markings or numbers on the tail of the plane, which was quite unusual for airplanes of that time. Normally, all military aircraft had an identification marking. But there was nothing on this plane. Its bright yellow surface almost reflected the light. I carefully landed my plane in the open area near the runway. There was a slight jolt as the wheels touched the ground. I turned off the engine and continued to look around carefully before getting out of the airplane. None of the technicians I saw turned to look at me. They didn't react at all, as if I wasn't there. As my eyes moved to the corner of the hangar, I realized that there were other planes inside, all yellow, all gleaming. I sat in my airplane for a while, not moving, just watching, because the only thing on my mind was the question, is this real? How had an abandoned airport become so full and modern in just a few hours? As I sat inside the plane, watching what was happening around me, I felt a strange uneasiness. Everything seemed too smooth and unreal. Just a few hours ago, this was an abandoned place, full of rusty hangars and weeds. Now it had become a vibrant, bustling, modern airport, as if from another era. There could be no logic to this transformation. The first thing I noticed was the behavior of the technicians. They were all working in an organized manner, but something seemed to be missing. None of them were talking or even communicating with each other. They were concentrating on the airplanes with the tools in their hands, but this work resembled a mechanical order rather than the movements of a normal human being. I noticed that while one technician was working bent under the plane, the other was standing just a few meters away, staring blankly into the hangar. When I noticed this, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I paid attention to the signs on the side of the hangar and realized that there was no writing on them. In fact, none of them were fully legible. There seemed to be letters, but when I tried to look closely, the shapes blurred and my eyes didn't know what to focus on. I had never experienced anything like this before. I looked up at the sky, and the storm had completely dissipated, revealing a blue, cloudless sky. But the position of the sun seemed strange to me. I seemed to have lost a sense of the passage of time. The sun was higher than it should have been, but when I looked at my watch it didn't seem possible. It was as if the clock in the sky was ticking at a completely different rhythm. I floated down from the cockpit of my plane and walked towards the hangar, my footsteps echoing eerily on the dirt runway. None of the technicians around me seemed to notice my presence. He had eyes, mouth, and nose, but lacked the natural expressions of a human being. I felt as if I was looking at a mask. As I stepped inside the hangar, I saw more and more airplanes. Some were familiar models, but others were completely unfamiliar. One plane caught my attention. Its size was quite small, but its structure was streamlined and its design was very modern. The fuselage seemed to be made entirely of shiny metal and there were no symbols or markings on it. I dared to touch the wings. The metal surface was cold, but at the same time smooth. The surfaces of the airplanes used at that time were usually a bit rougher and full of rivets. But there was nothing like that on this plane. Looking towards the cockpit, I saw a technological panel inside. A small beam of light was dancing on the panel. At that moment, I realized once again that what I was seeing was not possible, because this kind of technology would not exist for decades, let alone in 1935. For a moment I heard a humming sound coming from deep inside the hangar, low frequency but rhythmic. Although I couldn't see its source, it sounded as if it was coming from inside a metal structure. It was getting louder and louder and I started to feel a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. Just then one of the technicians suddenly stopped. He turned his head towards me. He didn't seem to have noticed it before, but now he was facing me completely. He looked at me for a few seconds without saying anything, then went back to work. I felt I couldn't stay in this situation any longer. The scenery around me was somehow pulling me in, but at the same time suffocating me. I had to get out of here as soon as possible. I went outside to get back to my plane, but another surprise was waiting for me outside. The sun was still shining when I stepped out of the hangar, but the surrounding silence had become even more disturbing. My eyes drifted back to the runway with the airplanes. The mechanics in blue overalls continued to work with the same rhythmic movements. I didn't want to watch them anymore. Every detail defied my logic. My mind was searching for a basis to explain what I was seeing, but it could find nothing. As I walked towards my plane, I felt time grow strangely heavy. My steps felt forced, as if they were stuck to the ground. Even the air around me seemed to condense. I took a deep breath and tried to speed up. I had to get out of this environment as soon as possible. When I reached my plane, I entered the cockpit to restart the engine. When I put my hand on the controls, I realized that my fingers were shaking. Although I am normally known as a cool-headed pilot who loves flying, this had completely overtaken me. I took a deep breath and started checking the controls. Everything was in place, but before starting the engine, I took another look outside. The technicians were still working in the same way. But one thing struck me. It was as if they had all paused at the same time. The moving hands hovered in the air for a moment, and then they started moving again. This strange moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was so clear that I couldn't believe my eyes. I started the engine and the plane's engine broke the uncomfortable silence and disappeared into the sky. As my plane slowly made its way down the runway, everything around me seemed to blur even more. The sun's rays were shining brighter than usual and dazzling my eyes. I realized then that this light was too strong to be real. As I accelerated to take off, the hangar and the planes I had left behind seemed to disappear into a fog. It was as if a curtain was closing and everything was being erased. But this erasure didn't seem to happen in a natural fog. It felt more like the end of a dream. Just as I took off, I looked out of the cockpit window for a moment, and there was none of the vivid images I had seen before. The runway was deserted and dilapidated. The roofs over the hangars had collapsed and weeds were everywhere. I blinked and looked again, and suddenly the abandoned image was back. At that moment, I felt that my experience was over. As my plane ascended, I could see no movement behind me. The technicians in blue overalls, the yellow planes and modern designs, all had disappeared. The sky had darkened again, the rain-laden clouds of the storm had returned. Trying to figure out if it was all real or imaginary, I focused on the devices in front of me. When I came back, I found myself in the familiar airport. Everything around me seemed normal, but my mind could never return to normal. Even the weeks had passed since the incident, I could not forget what I had seen with my eyes. My logic tried to explain it but failed. After a while, I tried to remember the models of the planes I had seen, especially the small, shiny metal plane I had seen inside the hangar. I knew that such a design was not possible at that time. However, years later, I saw these planes again. One of the planes I saw was produced exactly 20 years later, in 1955. Its design was almost indistinguishable from the one I saw in the hangar that day. This was the biggest shock for me. I didn't tell anyone about it, because I knew no one would believe me, but as the years passed, the experience remained a riddle in the back of my mind. Had I seen something beyond time, or was it just a trick of my mind? One day, while going through old records, I started researching the history of that airport. I found out that it had indeed been abandoned in 1935, but by the 1950s it had been converted into a modern airport. Also, the use of technicians in blue overalls was a standard practice by the British Air Force at the time. When I learned these details, I decided that what I had experienced could not have been a complete coincidence. But there was still one unanswered question. Was that plane I saw in the hangar really from the future? If so, what was I doing there? Was I in a different dimension of time, or had a simple air current dragged me into this strange situation? I thought about it for days. Perhaps the human mind is incapable of grasping the linear structure of time. Maybe that day I had unwittingly seen a rift in time. But I would never know that for sure. All I knew was that that airport had ceased to be an ordinary place for me.